Before I wrote my first book, I wish that I had heard what I'm about to tell you. Before I published my first book, I wish that I had heard what I'm about to tell you. No, it's actually nothing bad. No, I wasn't going to say that if I had heard this, then I would have stopped. Far from it. If I had heard this, I probably would have actually been done a heck of a lot faster. And I'm just going to start off by saying, yes, write that book. But watch this first because I think it's going to make the process a heck of a lot better. And I think it's going to make it a lot more fun and hopefully a lot more encouraging, because writing a book is one of the coolest things ever. It is one of the things that I am the most proud of. And when you finish that first book or second or however many, then you're going to feel amazing too.
Now, when it comes to writing in general, one of the number one questions is, where do you start? Like, I'm part of a lot of writing groups through Facebook, through Twitter, and it's amazing how many times you see, hey, I'm a new writer, where do I start? Hey, I'm a new writer, what are some tips and tricks that you recommend? Hey, I'm a writer and I've just gotten stuck, what do you guys recommend? So for this video, I really wanted to start by actually addressing that concept, but I'm gonna do something that not a lot of people do. See, when you hear, where do I start for actually writing a fantasy or any kind of book in general, you always hear, oh, you gotta have a good plot, and you gotta know where you want the story to go, so you also gotta know where your ending is. You need to know what the story actually is. Now, other people will say, no, that's not as important. You gotta know your characters. You gotta have good characters that the audience wants to relate to, good characters that can drive any plot forward. Still, other people are gonna say, no, the first thing you need is a setting. You need to figure out what kind of world you want this to take place in, what kind of rules are gonna apply, so that way all the characters and all the everything can fit in with it. But that is not where I'm going to start. And I feel that starting with those things is actually missing the biggest point. So I'm going to say the very first thing, the first place that you have to start when writing a fantasy or any kind of book in general, is you have to believe you can actually do it. And I say this not lightly. It sounds cheesy, sounds a little bit silly, but bear with me for a second. See, so many times people will start books, they will start writing, and then they get stuck. Or they'll start writing, they'll have a really cool idea, and then they're just not sure where to go with it. Still others will be writing, and they'll be going, and they'll be going, and it'll be great, and then they come to the end, and they're not sure how to end it, so they stop, and they put it down. But so many of these situations all come down to the writer gets to a point that it's hard, and then they stop believing they can actually get it done. So, like I said, the first thing is you actually have to believe that you can do it. And this is not the easiest thing in the world. I get it. When I wrote my first novel, I probably bit off a little bit more than I could chew, but it took me about 10 years time. Realistically, it was about 10 years from start to finish, and there was a lot that was going on with that. First, yes, I was creating a whole new fantasy world, so a lot of my writing of the book was also including the map making. So I created all my own maps. I still am touching up maps as new locations come about. So I created the world. I created the various government systems. I created the various nations. I figured out how territories and territory lines would actually work out. I thought about religions, thought about the pantheon god system, thought about the magic system, even spent time just creating various weapons for various cultures. So I did a lot of stuff other than writing. To be also perfectly honest, there was probably a fair amount of procrastination by doing those things, but in the end, I'm really happy that I did actually get all those guys figured out, and I'm satisfied with the end result. So with mine, the first book took me about 10 years, and there were a lot of instances where things got tricky. I got stuck. I got frustrated. There would be times where I'd be going along and things just weren't making sense. I'd be going along and events just wouldn't quite be working. So there were a lot of times that I seriously thought, man, should I give up on this thing? Should I even keep going? Do I even deserve to be considered a writer? I mean, to me, people who wrote books were like the coolest people ever. So did I even deserve to be in that category? And then after all those 10 years, finally got it done. And I'm not gonna lie, it was one of the best experiences. It was one of the best feelings in the world because it was one of those things that after honestly working hard at it and genuinely caring about the end result, to have it realized, it was amazing. So if you are in the boat of you started writing and then you got stuck, or you're not sure how to start, or maybe you've been writing for a long time and now you're just about done, but it suddenly feels a little bit too overwhelming, just don't. Just take away that thought that you can't do it, and just, again, sounds simple, it sounds cheesy, but you gotta believe that you actually can. Because the other reality, people have done it. You know, I know it sounds obvious, but it is not an impossible goal. So believe that you can do it, and you know what? I'm going to do a one-up. If you want to write a book, and if you have this cool idea that you think needs to be on the page, not only do I think that you should do it, I believe that you can. And I look forward to seeing what you come up with. Now, like I said, that's the first place to start. But the second place that isn't really a starting point per se, but it's the other thing that I want you to consider. While you're going along, there's a very strong desire for people to want to read your writing in progress. And I would caution against this. Now, there's a few reasons going on with this, but the first one is you're not done. You know, if you think about it, you start writing something and then you're going to have whatever draft it goes up to. And when people start to read it and they are naturally going to have ideas and opinions, some people are going to be very vocal in their opinions and they might be trying to counter things that you had in mind. Sometimes you're going to have an idea and you just can't finish the idea in the first chapter. It's going to take you a while. And if you have people trying to tell you, oh, this is what you should do, this is what your book should be, now suddenly you're not doing the story that you had originally planned. Now, the next thing, when you write your book, and I'm not even saying if at this point, like I said, I believe in you. So when you finish that first draft, you're going to find, especially if it's your first book, your ending is going to feel a lot stronger than your beginning. If you just write chapter 1, 2, 3 up until the end, if you do that in linear order, you're going to feel that your end is oftentimes going to be some of your strongest bit of writing. And there is actually a very logical reason for it. You're a better writer at the end. You know, you don't really think about this. You oftentimes think, oh, they're a better writer because they wrote so many books. Oh, they're a better writer in their second book than in their first book, or a better writer in their second series than in their first series. Well, people don't talk about that intermediate part. If you're just writing a book for the first time, then the first stuff that you write is going to be at your skill level at that time. And then as you write, as you learn how to develop things, as you learn how to draw out ideas a little bit more, as you learn how to make your writing come alive more, it's going to show by the end of it. So there's going to be this really interesting disconnect where the end feels much stronger than the beginning. This is actually very, very normal, and this is something that should not be criticized. This should actually be praised. And the reason it should be praised is because you are getting better as a writer, and that is always a good thing. But doesn't mean that you're done. It doesn't mean that you just say, okay, cool, we'll go with that, and I'm going to accept that the end is going to be better. No, this is your baby. Take care of your baby and make that beginning as strong as your end. And how do you do that? Revision. The revision process is something that a lot of people are are terrified of, because you hear so many stories about how you spend so much more time doing edits and revisions than you do actually writing the book. Now, I'm also going to make a really fast clarification here. Edits and revising are not the same thing. Edit means to fix errors, whereas revising is changing. So oftentimes you're going to have the two be synonymous, but editing is basically correcting errors. So it's correcting like punctuation, spelling errors, grammar errors, all those little nitpicky things. Whereas revision means you're going back and you're changing various elements. So this could be something as simple as you went through and maybe you didn't like the main character's name for whatever reason. So, had the main character be named Sam, but then as you were going along, you thought that it would be a lot stronger if the name was Samuel. A simple little thing. Well, Sam is not wrong, but it's not what you want to have. So you go back and when you revise, you change that name Sam to Samuel, go from there. Other times, this is going to mean you need to add characters, because oftentimes in the beginning, we're going to write with the beginning to the end, the events that are necessary to get from point A to point B, and just make sure those guys are connected. So with the revising, now you're going back and you're basically giving it a little bit more life. In some situations, this is going to mean you need to spend a little bit more time on setting, actually describing some of the things. Tolkien is a great example. I'm a huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien. He did a really great job describing locations, describing scenery, describing trees. He loved to describe that stuff. Some people are not as big of a fan with that much description. That is okay. It's your style, but the whole purpose of that section is to give the reader an idea of where they are. And in some cases, you actually, as a reader or as a writer, you want the reader to stay in an area for a little bit longer. And this is easily solved by just having more text. If you wrote, for example, they went from this town to this town and that was it. You had one sentence explaining this entire journey. Then the reader is going to read, they went from this town to this town and nothing in between mattered. Well, does any of the stuff in there matter? Sometimes it does. Sometimes it genuinely doesn't. But sometimes when you're writing, you want to convey the sense of traveling for a long time by having the reader read for a little bit longer. If the reader feels like they've read for a while, then they feel like the journey has taken a fair amount of time. On the other hand, sometimes you don't want the journey to be that important. You want it to pass by fairly quickly. And so therefore, you have just a little bit less. One really interesting thing that happens when you're doing revisions is sometimes you find that small characters need a much bigger role. And I experienced this with mine. And it was a really cool thing because I had the basic story. I had really one main character and he had his storyline. He did his stuff and it worked. It was good. But while I wanted to convey the sense that these people that were traveling together were a group, I also wanted them to be friends. And I wanted them to have established friendships. So after I went through and worked a lot of the plot, I went back and filled out some of the backstory with them. And it was a lot of fun because in the process, I created character relations that I had not planned on later, but it created bonds early on so that when they acted, it felt very personal and it felt like these people genuinely cared about each other. And that wasn't a thing in the first couple drafts. I had to get all the elements. I had to get enough people to do the jobs. I had to get enough scenery for them to do the stuff. But it was only later on that I was able to really get into their personalities and in some areas get into their backstories. And I was really happy when I actually could. So again, this was something that really only could have happened with revision. Because as awesome as you are, you probably can't get everything in the first draft. You probably cannot get every part of the story that you want in the first draft. And so the revisions are so that you can go back and make sure that you get what you want in there. Revisions are not bad things. Now, another classic question, and I'm just going to throw this at you, but before before going into writing, I really want to drive this home that you're not just going to write a draft and then it's going to get published and you're going to make your multi-millions. Doesn't happen for most people. Some people do, very rarely, but for the most part, your first draft is just that. It is your first draft, and then you use the other drafts to revise. So before you decide that you're going to get into writing, I really do want you to know that it's going to be a process, and it's not a bad process. It is so much fun. Oh my gosh, it is so much fun. I love seeing how my story comes alive, but there is a lot to it. So when you are starting, you have to remember that yes, you absolutely can do it, but it is not necessarily going to be a quick thing. So if you can remember those major details, that's the first step to actually writing a book.